Once upon a time long ago, in the great kingdom of Israel, a boy named Solomon walked through the royal gardens, his mind filled with thoughts far beyond his years. The scent of blooming jasmine filled the air, and the gentle hum of bees floated around him, but he hardly noticed. His heart was heavy. His father, King David, was dying. He knew this day would come, but still, he wasn't ready. "Solomon," a voice called. "Come inside," she said softly. "Your father needs to speak with you." Solomon swallowed hard and nodded. His life was about to change forever. Inside the royal chambers, the air was thick with the scent of incense and oil. King David lay on his bed, his face pale but his eyes still full of fire. Solomon knelt beside him. "Father." David smiled weakly. "My son, my wise son." Solomon's throat tightened. He was not a warrior like his older brothers. He had never led an army or fought in battles. He was known for his quick mind, not his strong sword. And yet, he had been chosen. David's voice was weak but steady. "The Lord has told me that you, not Adonijah, not Absalom, you will be king after me." Solomon's heart pounded. He had known this, but hearing it now, in this moment, it felt real. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. David reached out, gripping his son's hand with surprising strength. "No king is ever ready, but the Lord will be with you." Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, stepped forward. "You must go to the priest and the prophet. They will anoint you before the people." Solomon took a deep breath. He had no choice. The time had come. The next morning, the streets of Jerusalem were alive with the sound of trumpets. People gathered in the courtyards whispering, watching as Zadok the priest poured oil over Solomon's head, anointing him as king. He felt the warm oil trickle down his forehead, and with it came the weight of responsibility. The priest raised his voice, "Long live King Solomon!" The people erupted in cheers. But in the distance, Solomon saw his brother, Adonijah, watching from the shadows. Adonijah had tried to take the throne for himself just days ago. He was not happy about this. Solomon met his gaze but said nothing. This was only the beginning, and he had a kingdom to rule. The golden halls of the palace were quiet that night. Solomon sat on his father's throne, but he still felt like a boy pretending to be a man. The cheers of the people still rang in his ears, but so did the warning glances of his enemies. He was king now, but how long would they let him rule? Would they challenge him? Would they betray him? A heavy sigh escaped his lips. How could he, a young man, lead an entire kingdom? Footsteps echoed in the chamber. Solomon turned to see Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet approaching. "You have been crowned," Zadok said, his voice calm. "But are you ready to rule?" Solomon hesitated. Nathan studied him. "Your father trusted in the Lord for every battle, every decision. Will you do the same?" Solomon looked down at his hands. His father had been a warrior, a leader, a man after God's own heart, and he was just Solomon. Nathan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tonight, seek the Lord." Solomon nodded, knowing there was only one thing he could do. He would go to Gibeon, where the great altar stood, and he would pray. That night, under the vast sky of Gibeon, Solomon stood before the altar. The torches flickered, casting golden light on the smooth stones. He knelt, closing his eyes, letting the silence settle around him. And then, a voice. Solomon. His eyes flew open. The presence of the Lord filled the space around him. His heart pounded as he heard the voice again, "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." Solomon's breath caught. Anything. Wealth, power, victory over his enemies? For a brief moment, the thought tempted him. But then he remembered the way his father had led. He remembered the weight of the crown on his head. Slowly, he bowed his head. "Lord, I am young, and I do not know how to lead. Your people are many, and I am only one man. Give me wisdom and understanding, so that I may rule them well." Silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Because you have asked for wisdom and not riches or long life, I will grant your request. I will give you wisdom greater than any king before or after you." A rush of power, of clarity, of peace filled Solomon's heart. And when he opened his eyes, he knew. He had changed. God had answered, and the true test of his wisdom was about to begin. The next morning, as Solomon returned to Jerusalem, the city was already buzzing with a new challenge. Two women stood before the throne, their voices raised in argument. "My king," one woman cried, her face streaked with tears, "we lived in the same house. We both had babies. But this woman's baby died in the night, and she stole mine." The second woman shook her head. "No, the living baby is mine. She is lying." Solomon looked between them, two women, one child, both claiming to be the mother. The court fell silent. How could he decide? A guard leaned toward him. "Shall we dismiss them, my king? There is no way to know the truth." But Solomon raised a hand. "Bring me a sword." Gasps echoed through the hall. A sword was placed before him. Solomon looked at both women. "If you both claim this child, then the only fair thing to do is to divide him in two. Each of you shall have half." The second woman nodded quickly. "Yes, my lord, that is fair." But the first woman let out a wail. She fell to her knees, clutching the hem of Solomon's robe. Solomon smiled. There. That was the answer. He rose from his throne. "Give the child to the first woman. She is the true mother. Only a real mother would sacrifice herself to save her son." Word of Solomon's wisdom spread like fire through the kingdom, and that day Israel knew. Their new king had been touched by the hand of God. The kingdom of Israel was changing. Under Solomon's rule, it flourished like never before. The people marveled at his wisdom. Leaders traveled from distant lands to seek his advice. Merchants carried stories of his judgments to the edges of the known world. And yet, Solomon knew. He was just beginning. Sitting on his throne, he listened as his advisors read through the latest reports. Trade was increasing. The treasury was full. Peace reigned throughout the land. For the first time in Israel's history, there were no wars to fight. The people rejoiced, but Solomon, he knew his true task had yet to begin. One evening, as the sun cast golden light over Jerusalem, Solomon met with Nathan the prophet. "The kingdom is thriving," Solomon said, "but something is missing." Nathan studied him. "What do you seek, my king?" Solomon hesitated before answering. "My father David longed to build a house for the Lord, but God told him it was not for him to do." Nathan nodded. "Because he was a man of war, but you, Solomon, you have been given peace." Solomon's eyes burned with determination. Then I will do what my father could not." Solomon nodded. He was ready. The next morning, Solomon called for Hiram, the king of Tyre. Hiram had been a loyal friend to David, and he ruled over the great forests of Lebanon, where the finest cedar trees in the world grew. Solomon greeted him warmly. "Hiram, my father spoke of you often. I seek your help in an important task. I wish to build a temple for the Lord, a house that will stand for generations. I need cedar from your forests and skilled workers to carve the finest wood." Hiram chuckled. "A temple? That is no small request, Solomon." Solomon smiled. "Neither is the task God has given me." Hiram let out a deep laugh. "I like you, boy. Your father was a man of war, but you're a builder." He clapped Solomon on the back. "I will send my best men. Your father was a great king, and I believe you will be even greater." Solomon bowed in gratitude. The temple would be built. Years passed. The construction of the temple of the Lord became the greatest project ever undertaken in Israel. Tens of thousands of men worked day and night, carving massive stones, shaping gold, and crafting intricate designs from the cedar wood of Lebanon. Solomon oversaw every detail. The walls were covered in pure gold. The floors were made of the finest stone. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred place, was built to house the Ark of the Covenant. Finally, after 7 years of labor, the temple was finished. On the day of its dedication, thousands gathered in the courtyards. Priests stood in rows. The sound of harps and trumpets filled the air, and the fragrance of burning incense rose to the heavens. Solomon stepped forward. He raised his hands to the sky and prayed before the people. As he finished speaking, a great cloud descended upon the temple. The people gasped. The presence of the Lord filled the sanctuary. A great silence fell over the crowd, and then a roar of voices lifted in praise. Solomon bowed his head. God had accepted the temple. His father's dream had finally been fulfilled, and his own legacy had begun. That night, as Solomon sat alone in his chamber, staring at the temple in the distance, he heard a voice. "Solomon." His breath caught. It was the same voice he had heard at Gibeon. Solomon felt the weight of those words. He had been given wisdom, power, wealth, and now God's presence in the temple. But he also knew what was at stake. If he ever turned away from the Lord, the kingdom would be lost forever. Solomon clenched his fists. He would be the greatest king Israel had ever known, and he would never, never forget the God who had given him everything. Or so he thought. Trade routes stretched across the lands, bringing wealth from Egypt, Persia, and beyond. The marketplaces overflowed with gold, spices, and fine linen. Poets sang of Solomon's wisdom, and travelers came from distant kingdoms just to hear his words. The temple stood tall in the heart of Jerusalem, a symbol of God's blessing upon the nation. Israel had never been greater, and neither had Solomon. One morning, Solomon stood on the palace balcony, gazing over the city. The streets were alive with laughter, music, and the hum of prosperity. A servant approached, bowing low. "My lord, another envoy has arrived." Solomon raised an eyebrow. "From where this time?" "From Sheba, my king. The queen herself has come." Solomon's lips curved into a smile. He had heard of the Queen of Sheba, a ruler as wealthy as she was wise, famous for her knowledge and power. If she had come all this way, it meant she wanted something. And Solomon was eager to see what. That afternoon, the great halls of the palace filled with whispers as the Queen of Sheba entered. She wore flowing robes of deep crimson, embroidered with gold. Jewels adorned her neck and wrists, and her presence commanded the room before she even spoke. Solomon studied her carefully. She studied him right back. Finally, she spoke. "They say you are the wisest king to ever live," she said smoothly. "I have come to see if that is true." Solomon chuckled. "And how will you decide?" She smiled. "With questions, of course." For hours, she tested him. She spoke of riddles. He solved them. She asked about the stars, the seas, the mysteries of the world. He answered with knowledge beyond her imagination. Finally, she leaned back, her eyes gleaming with something between admiration and amusement. "It is true," she admitted. "Your wisdom is greater than I ever imagined." Solomon nodded. "Wisdom is only useful if it is shared." The queen tilted her head. "Then share something with me, O great king. What is the secret to your success?" Solomon's smile faltered for just a second. He should have said the Lord. He should have spoken of God's favor, of the covenant made with David, of the warning God had given him, but instead, he said, wisdom. A king must always seek knowledge above all things. The Queen of Sheba nodded thoughtfully. "A wise answer." Solomon forced a smile, but deep down, a small voice whispered, "You have forgotten." As the years went on, Solomon's wisdom grew, but so did his desire for more. More riches, more knowledge, more power, more wives. He married princesses from Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, women from every nation. He told himself it was for alliances, for peace. These women brought their gods with them. Solomon let them stay. At first, he only tolerated them, the altars, the incense, the foreign rituals, but over time, he found himself standing near their temples, watching, listening, compromising. The great king, the wise ruler, the man who had prayed for nothing but wisdom, was slipping, and he didn't even realize it. One evening, as Solomon walked through the royal gardens, an old voice spoke behind him. "Nathan the prophet." Solomon turned, smiling. "Nathan, it's been some time." Nathan's face was grim. "Too much time, my king." Solomon sighed, already sensing the weight of the conversation. "What troubles you?" Nathan's eyes darkened. "You do?" Solomon stiffened. Nathan continued, "You have built the temple for the Lord, yes, but look around you. Altars to foreign gods stand beside it. You have let your heart wander from the one who gave you this kingdom." Solomon frowned. "I have not abandoned the Lord." Nathan took a step closer. "Not yet, but your feet are on the path, and you must turn back before it is too late." Solomon looked away. "You do not understand the burden of a king, Nathan. The alliances must be kept strong." Nathan's voice grew sharper. "You are not called to build alliances with men. You were called to be faithful to God." Silence stretched between them. Solomon had no answer, because deep down, he knew the prophet was right. That night, Solomon stood alone in his chamber, staring at the temple he had built. The city still thrived. The wealth still flowed. The people still called his name in praise. But something inside him felt hollow. The Lord had warned him. If you turn away, the kingdom will be torn apart. Had he already begun to destroy the very thing God had given him? He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer. But the words felt empty, because his heart was no longer fully the Lord's, and he feared that one day soon he would have to face the consequences. Solomon sat alone in his chamber, the golden glow of the temple flickering through the windows. Outside, Jerusalem was thriving. The streets were filled with merchants selling silks from Persia, spices from Arabia, and gold from Ophir. The people lived in prosperity and peace, their bellies full and their homes secure. By all appearances, Solomon's reign was perfect, and yet his heart was restless. He should have felt fulfilled, victorious, content, but he didn't, because he knew. He had built altars for his wives, allowed them to burn incense and offer sacrifices to gods that were not the Lord, and he had stood there and watched. At first he told himself it was harmless. He didn't worship them, he only allowed it. Then he told himself it was political. His wives were from powerful nations. If he angered them, it could cause war. But now, he found himself walking past those altars more and more, stopping, listening, wondering. And for the first time in his life, he felt far from the God who had given him everything. One morning, as Solomon walked through the palace gardens, a familiar voice called out to him, "My king!" Solomon turned and saw Ahijah the prophet standing beneath an olive tree. The last time he had seen Ahijah, the prophet had spoken blessings over his kingdom, but today his face was grim. Solomon sighed. "I already know why you've come." Ahijah nodded. "Then you know what the Lord has said?" Solomon exhaled. "Say it anyway." Ahijah took a deep breath, then spoke with fire in his voice. "Because you have turned from the Lord and have worshipped foreign gods, the kingdom will be torn from your hands." Solomon's blood ran cold. Ahijah continued, "But for the sake of your father David, this will not happen in your lifetime. It will happen in the days of your son. The kingdom will be divided." Solomon felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. "Divided?" he whispered. Ahijah nodded. "Yes, 10 tribes will be taken away. Only one will remain for the house of David." Solomon's chest tightened. The throne that he had built with wisdom and peace would shatter the moment he was gone. And it was his fault. That night, Solomon sat on his throne, staring at the temple. He remembered the day he had dedicated it. The cloud of God's presence had filled the courts. The people had fallen to their knees in awe, and now idols stood alongside it. Now the God of Israel was one of many worshipped in Jerusalem. His greatest fear had come true. He had become the very thing his father had fought against, a king who had compromised, a king who had turned away. And now there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. Solomon called for his scribes. If he could not change the future, he could at least leave behind his wisdom. And so, in the final years of his reign, he wrote. He wrote proverbs, lessons for those who would come after him. He wrote of his regrets. And in his writings, he left one final warning. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Because he had learned too late that all the wisdom in the world meant nothing. Without obedience to the Lord, the kingdom of Israel was still strong. The people still praised his name, but Solomon knew his reign was ending. And when he was gone, everything would fall apart. Because he had let it. Solomon sat on the steps of his palace, watching the sun sink behind the hills of Jerusalem. The golden rooftops of the city shimmered in the fading light, a reminder of all he had built. And yet, his heart was heavy. He had spent years filling Israel with wealth, wisdom, and power. But now, the Lord's words echoed in his mind. The kingdom will be torn from your hands. For the first time in his life, Solomon felt helpless. A king who had everything, yet nothing at all. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "My lord?" Solomon turned. It was Benaiah, his most trusted captain. Solomon let out a tired sigh. There is always trouble. Benaiah hesitated. This is different. Jeroboam is stirring rebellion. Solomon's hands tightened into fists. Jeroboam. A young leader, once one of Solomon's best officials, now turning the people against him. He had seen it coming. The moment Ahijah the prophet had torn his cloak into 12 pieces and told Jeroboam that 10 tribes would be his, Solomon had known. But knowing and accepting were two different things. Solomon stood, his robes flowing behind him. Find him. Stop him. Benaiah nodded. And if he resists. Solomon's gaze darkened. Then he must die. Benaiah hesitated. But my lord, if the Lord has already decreed, his voice echoed through the courtyard. Benaiah bowed low. As you wish. Then he turned and disappeared into the night. Solomon stood alone. The cool evening breeze rustled the trees, whispering through the palace halls. He pressed a hand to his chest. His heart ached. Am I truly so far gone? Am I fighting against the will of the Lord? The same Lord who had appeared to him at Gibeon. The same Lord who had filled the temple with his presence. The same Lord he had betrayed. He let out a bitter laugh. He had written so many proverbs about wisdom, and yet he had been the fool. Later that night, Solomon called for Nathan, the prophet. The old man entered, his face weary as if he had expected this moment. Solomon leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now. Tell me the truth, Nathan. Is there anything I can do to stop this? Nathan sighed. You already know the answer. Solomon closed his eyes. I thought wisdom would be enough. I thought if I was the greatest king, the strongest ruler, that God would always bless me. Nathan stepped closer. Wisdom was never meant to replace obedience. The words hit Solomon like a stone. Nathan continued, his voice firm but not unkind. God loved you, Solomon. He gave you more than any man before you, but you built altars to false gods. You let your heart be divided, and now the kingdom will be divided as well. Solomon's throat tightened. Will my son suffer for my sins? Nathan's gaze softened. Rehoboam will rule, but he will not be strong enough to hold the kingdom together, because he will inherit more than your throne. He will inherit your failures. Solomon turned away, his voice barely a whisper. Leave me. Nathan bowed. May the Lord have mercy on you, my king. Then he was gone. Solomon sat in silence. The sounds of the city drifted through the open windows, the laughter of families, the songs of merchants, the quiet murmur of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. For years, He had tried to control his fate. Now he saw the truth. He had wasted the wisdom God had given him. He had built the temple but lost the heart of the kingdom. His greatest enemy had never been Jeroboam, or the foreign kings, or the prophets who spoke against him. His greatest enemy had been himself. The next morning, Benaiah returned. "My lord, Jeroboam has fled to Egypt." Solomon nodded, staring out at the city below. It didn't matter. His time was running out, and soon another would sit on this throne. The question was, would his son learn from his mistakes? Or would history repeat itself? Solomon lay in his chamber, his body weak and frail, though his mind still raced with memories of his reign. The golden walls of his palace shimmered in the torchlight, but they no longer brought him pride. The tapestries of lions and eagles, the gifts from foreign kings, they meant nothing now, for all his wealth, all his wisdom. He had lost the one thing that mattered. His heart had wandered from the Lord, and now he was alone. A quiet knock came at the door. Solomon turned his head. "Enter." His son, Rehoboam, stepped inside. He was young, strong, the next ruler of Israel. Solomon studied him, a painful truth settling deep in his chest. This was the boy who would sit on the throne when he was gone. Would he be better than his father, or would he repeat the same mistakes? Rehoboam knelt by his bedside. "Father, the people are waiting. What would you have me do?" Solomon let out a slow breath. The people. He had taxed them heavily to build the temple, the palace, the roads that stretched across the kingdom. Would his son be wise enough to lead them well? Would he be merciful? Or would he let pride destroy him, just as Solomon had? Solomon reached for Rehoboam's hand, gripping it with the last of his strength. "Listen to wisdom, my son. Do not make the mistakes I did." Rehoboam's brow furrowed. "What mistakes?" Solomon let out a bitter chuckle. "I thought wisdom alone would keep me strong. But wisdom without obedience is like a river without banks. It goes wherever it pleases, but it leads only to ruin." Rehoboam looked uncertain. "But you were the wisest of all kings." Solomon's grip tightened. "And yet, I was still a fool." Silence stretched between them. Then Solomon whispered, "Remember the Lord. Above all else, remember the Lord." Rehoboam swallowed hard. "I will try, Father." Solomon sighed. "No, my son, do more than try. Choose." Because he had not chosen. He had allowed his heart to drift, and now the kingdom would be torn in two because of it. As Rehoboam left, Solomon turned his head toward the window. The temple, the one he had spent 7 years building, stood against the horizon. Would it stand forever? Or would it fall just like he had? That night, Solomon dreamed. He was standing at Gibeon again, a young man, fresh in his kingship. And there was the Lord, the same voice that had spoken to him all those years ago. "What do you ask of me?" the Lord had asked him then. Solomon remembered his answer. "Give me wisdom that I may lead your people." And the Lord had given it, and Solomon had wasted it. His eyes fluttered open. The fire in his chamber burned low. He took a slow breath, his body growing weaker. He had written so many words, proverbs, songs, reflections on life. But in the end, only one lesson truly mattered. He reached for a scroll at his bedside, the last of his writings. His voice was a whisper as he read the final words he had penned. "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." His hands trembled. If only he had listened to those words sooner. Then perhaps his ending would have been different. The great King Solomon breathed his last that night. And as the palace fell into mourning, the city of Jerusalem carried on, unaware that its golden age was about to end. Because the wisdom of a man, no matter how great, can only hold a kingdom together for so long. And when that man forgets the Lord, everything falls apart.